guys, even though I can't see you. But I've been talking about this topic for a while, and I thought that it was actually starting to get old, but actually it's still very mythical, the whole BIOS to UEFI, and there's lots of questions that pop up in the various forums and Reddit and blogs and whatnot. So I think it's still a very relevant topic because a majority of the devices are still shipped as Class 2 UEFI devices. And I know at my company we even get some that are still coming set as legacy BIOS that need to be flipped to UEFI so that they're deployed properly. But I don't have a way of polling everybody today, but just curious as to how many people are running Windows 10, who's halfway done, who hasn't started. And really Windows 10 it's kind of an ongoing effort because of the lifespan of Windows 10 being about 18 months. Microsoft has settled on doing 2 feature updates per year now. I still think it's a little aggressive for the enterprise. I think 1 would be ideal. You can skip if you allow yourself enough time to skip releases, but really want you to jump in to each release that they come out with. So there's the challenge of not only getting to Windows 10 from probably Windows 7 for the most of you, but then once you're on Windows 10, the work doesn't stop. You have Windows as a service that kicks in. I'm not going to cover that in this presentation. However, the task sequences that I'm going to show should position you to be able to handle at least part of that, because you're going to have 2 task sequences going forward for most likely for bare metal break fix machines as well as in-place upgrade. And it shouldn't matter whether you're going from Windows 7 to Windows 10 or an earlier version of Windows 10 to Windows 10. A few years ago, before Microsoft released a little utility that came out in a creator's update that I'll talk about later called MBR to GPT, I was really encouraging people to do Win 7 in UEFI hybrid mode, something that wasn't very common, but what it did allow for was you to do in-place upgrade in a non-destructive fashion, so you could actually retain your user data and your apps. It's not so much an issue now that we have MBR to GPT, unless you've got some of the other hard blockers, like third-party disk encryption is really the main one. If you have that, I don't know of any third-party disk encryption companies that actually work with MBR to GPT. TPM and BitLocker will work with this process. There are some tricks to get it to work, and hopefully I can go into a little bit of detail on how to do that. I've blogged about it as well. And then inventory. That's really, you need to know what you're up against in terms of your environment. So you still want to determine what models are actually supported by your vendors. I know HP has a pretty good list of what versions they test against for which models. And you can always recommend that those models that are no longer tested are no longer supported, and that they actually should be life cycled. So we have 2 ways to get to Windows 10. Actually, there's 3 now that Microsoft's released autopilot, but you're already at Windows 10 when you have that device. So this is more for your existing systems in the enterprise. We've got the wipe and load process, and we've got in-place upgrade. So it was just over a year ago when Configuration Manager Current Branch 1610 was released that the Configuration Manager team introduced a new variable called TSUEFI drive that actually allowed you to reboot a legacy BIOS machine into UEFI. Before that, it wasn't possible using native Microsoft tools, but they allowed that to happen. You still had to do a few other things, like use the vendor firmware and stuff like that. They don't handle that. This process is required for if you're going from x86 to x64. Third-party disk encryption, they'll include some filter drivers, which also work with the in-place upgrade, starting with Windows 10, 1607 Microsoft drivers. You want to do any kind of language changes, maybe have screwed up configurations. Maybe you went crazy on the number of disk partitions and you separated user data from the OS disk and you want to pull that back together. That's not necessarily easy to fix in an in-place upgrade, so chances are you want to just start that fresh. And then lastly, like I said, yeah, you're up to the vendor tools and utilities for completing that puzzle. Now, for in-place upgrade, we call that a non-destructive process. It was about last December, I believe it was, Microsoft introduced in a Windows 10 blog the first mention of the MBR to GPT utility that was released with Windows 10 Creators Update. However, they still leave it up to you to do the vendor utilities as well in that particular case. Now, some pros and cons to wipe and load. We talked about doing a clean start in case you just have things out of control or a mess. Maybe you have a Windows 7 box that's been out there for a while, and yeah, you just want to start fresh on that machine. So definitely a wipe and load is a good scenario for that. You could use this same task sequence to do bare metal break, fix, and refresh. So the goal is to minimize the number of task sequences that you maintain. Ideally, you want to be at 2 task sequences per Windows version. So for 1709, I would only have a wipe and load task sequence and an in-place upgrade task sequence. The minute you start increasing the number of task sequences, your workload just goes up exponentially. However, Microsoft introduced nested task sequences recently, which, if done correctly, can actually minimize some of the rework that you need to do when doing your task sequence editing. Now, the cons are it's a destructive process. This means if your users have data on there, that data needs to be captured, stored somewhere off the disk, and then it needs to be restored after the new OS is installed and the applications are installed. So that's tricky. The other thing too are applications are going to be needed to be completely reloaded. Now, maybe you want to go with a minimal footprint going forward with Windows 10, so maybe that's your strategy to get there and go more to a user-centric type model for applications instead of just installing all these apps because they were there previously. We're going to reinstall these apps. That increases your management footprint for patching and attack vectors and other things. So a minimal approach is always good. And now we'll get into a little demo, wipe and load. So I've made a few of these task sequences available, at least template versions of them available on my blog. I like to keep everything really quite modular, knowing that nested task sequences were coming, and I haven't actually split out all of these. I've started to do it for a few of the groups, but the goal is to treat things very Lego-like. It's just snap this out, snap this in, and we're good to go. And maybe even one day we can get a community list of task sequences that are shared You want to do something, you go grab that module, put it in your task sequence library, and you can reference it, and you're good to go. Obviously, there are challenges with steps that have related content associated. We'll always have those, but hopefully it gets people to a certain starting point. So the key thing to remember, if you're doing bare metal, and depending upon how you boot the system, like take that Class 2 UEFI device that was shipped from the OEM as legacy BIOS, if I just pixie boot that, CM is going to see that as a legacy BIOS machine. Now, if we were just to proceed and build it normally, even though we might have a partition disk UEFI step in here, it's not going to actually process that because it booted legacy BIOS. So this is only for systems that you've forced it to legacy pixie boot. And there is a separate setting for the network stack in UEFI so that you can UEFI pixie boot that you need to be aware of. However, this is where the BIOS to UEFI part comes in. You can account for the situations that the machine is booting either legacy BIOS or UEFI already. So I talked a little bit about BitLocker. You want to disable BitLocker before this process, otherwise you're going to get stuck at a BitLocker recovery key somewhere along the way, whether it's right after flashing the BIOS or one of the reboots. Now the Windows 10 setup engine should see that BitLocker is on the system, and it should suspend BitLocker automatically for you. My preference is to go ahead and suspend BitLocker ahead of time and then re-enable it at the end of the task sequence when we know that we're safe to re-enable it and we're not going to get hit with the BitLocker recovery key screen that will interrupt the task sequence flow. Now, I think it was starting with version Windows 8. They introduced a reboot count. I believe that's what the RC switch stands for right here. You can actually tell it just to suspend indefinitely, not for a number of reboots, because you might have one reboot, you might have two reboots, and the Windows 7 version actually doesn't honor that switch. So there is a built-in step here for Windows 7, and the key thing is you want to remember that this will only suspend it for one reboot. So if you are flashing the BIOS, you need to check and see if it was re-enabled again under Windows 7 and suspend it once more. So for those of you using BitLocker, just be conscious of that. So if you have BIOS passwords, typically when I speak in front of groups, I'll poll how many people are using BIOS. And I've seen in the range of 30 to 40% of the enterprises using BIOS passwords. I think BIOS passwords are important for multiple reasons. However, BIOS passwords are extremely difficult to manage because the vendors don't give us an easy mechanism for doing so. And there's also certain flaws out there with certain vendors of how they do BIOS password management too, that you got to be careful so that those passwords don't get into the wrong hands, or password bin files don't get into the wrong hands, that kind of thing. It's always good to update your BIOS, especially on your older machines. Some of the vendor utilities don't work so well. If you're using a newer release of the vendor utility, it might not work so well if your BIOS is out of date. Another thing is you'll see that they support Windows 10 after a certain BIOS release. So if you've never flashed the BIOS in your environment, it's good to do that before actually using the utilities or methods that are provided. Otherwise, you might not get the desired outcome when you go to set certain BIOS settings. And once you set these settings, now you're talking about a desk side visit, because likely chance you've changed it to something, maybe you've changed it to UEFI but not something else, and it's not booting properly, and you're not going to get into that machine. Now for BIOS to UEFI, this is where the bulk of it is. In a wipe and load scenario, it doesn't really matter whether we're doing the UEFI switch after we do the firmware settings. In the in-place upgrade, it does matter, but we'll go ahead and handle the firmware settings first. Now, there are other ways that you can do firmware settings. You can do direct scripts. There's references on my blog on how to do Dell models, for example, and whatnot, but that's pretty much up to you to handle. Microsoft does not handle that for you. But immediately right after that, what you're going to have is a partition to 0 step in here. And this is where that magic entry comes into play, the TS UEFI drive variable right here. You want to set this variable here. This is what tells Configuration Manager, hey, I know you want to reboot UEFI and you're currently running legacy BIOS because the BIOS changes hasn't taken effect yet. It's okay to do so. That's basically what that variable means. In the documentation, originally they had this value set to a very low number. I think it was 500 or so. And depending upon the size of your boot image, you would get a failure. And the failure is basically ran out of space when it was extracting the WinPE boot image onto this drive. It just exceeded the space of this. So my rule of thumb is set it to 1,000. I forget what the error number is exactly, but set it to 1,000 because if you loaded your boot image up with a lot of the optional components like PowerShell, which requires .NET, then chances are your boot image is quite large, and you're going to experience that. Now, once you've done this, Configuration Manager can now actually stage the boot image on the proper partition, and you can actually use the built-in restart computer step, selecting the boot image that's associated with the task sequence, and it'll go from there. I'm still not sure why they didn't just partition it like it's normally going to be set up, why require the double partition step, because frankly it could have been done in one partition disk step. However, that's how it has to work. So right after the restart, you're going to partition it for the permanent partition structure in here. Now, one thing I noticed when I was doing the in-place upgrade testing was the recovery partition was handled under certain cases. Now, if you have very large disks, I think the built-in Microsoft step is to take this partition and do it to 99%. And on a large disk, 1% leaves you a pretty good sized recovery partition. So the way that I handle that is I typically say create this as 100 and then go ahead and run a script right after this, which just basically calls a recovery partition script. And I don't have that one open. Oh yeah, here we go. And basically what this is going to do is it will go ahead and select the third partition. It'll go ahead and shrink that third partition to 499 meg at the very end and create our recovery partition at the end so that we're not chewing up a whole bunch of disk space in the recovery partition. There are certain rules that Windows follows for recovery partitions as well. It will want to try to auto-grow that partition if it needs to, which is the other reason why it's highly recommended, or why Windows wants the recovery partition to come right after the Windows partition, because if there's space on the Windows partition, which there should be during an in-place upgrade, it requires 20 gig free disk space on x64. It can go ahead and shrink it down and expand the recovery partition if it butts up to the Windows partition in that particular case. So that's really all that's to it in terms of using Configuration Manager's method for doing BIOS to UEFI in a wipe and load scenario. The rest of the task sequence at this point is pretty standard, where you're gonna pre-provision BitLocker, apply your operating system. Remember, this is a wipe and load, so we've deleted everything off the disk if it was running BitLocker previously. If it was bare metal, it wasn't, so you'll still want to pre-provision BitLocker and go from there. So, and it looks just like the normal part of the rest of the task sequence. So not much to it, but it is tricky to get working under certain cases, and you always want to test across your various hardware models. You don't want to make an assumption that the commands you have for HP on this model are going to work on the next model. I've seen, I think, up to 3 different types of HP commands for doing BIOS to UEFI, depending upon the models that you're in your environment. And the reason is HP at one point had, I think, 3 different BIOS teams. So just be careful on that. Don't blindly send anything out. Always test, test, test. Now, for in-place upgrade, BIOS to UEFI, the pros are it's a non-destructive process, which is fantastic. This is the absolute fastest way to get to Windows 10. We don't have to do any reloading of the applications. We don't have to save the user data, do any backup and restores, and it's pretty bulletproof. I'll say pretty bulletproof in air quotes. It all depends upon what software is currently running on the system. The 2 big blockers tend to be third-party antivirus, as well as disk encryption. There's caveats to both of those that you need to make sure play well with the actual in-place upgrade process. But if those aren't a factor, then it's pretty smooth sailing, and I've seen very few failures as a result of anything else. The cons, once again, we talked about preserving unwanted stuff. If you got years and years of things that have accumulated on that Windows 7 system, you might just want to get rid of it. It's only for existing managed systems, so you have to have a config manager client running on it, and it's got to be functional. The health in config manager current branch is actually probably the best it's ever been, and it's pretty robust and bulletproof. So if you're doing regular software distributions or software updates, chances are you have a functioning client. However, there are edge cases where you might not. If you're going from x86 to x64, in-place upgrade doesn't work. Same for base language. So if you're going from a different base language, say like ENGB to ENUS or something else, you can't change that either. You cannot downgrade the SKU, and you could only use the installation media, meaning we can't do a custom WIM on that installation media and use that as part of an in-place upgrade process. We can service the WIM, meaning we can apply the latest cumulative update so that you're not upgrading a person and then turning around and them having to load up a 1 gig plus cumulative update, chewing up another 45 to 60 minutes of time, depending upon network speeds. So you could service that, install that WIM with the CUs, but you can't use a custom WIM. And if at all costs, depending upon your scenarios, you should try to look to get away from customizing WIMs as much as possible and doing things outside of the WIM so that it makes life easier going forward for you. Now, MBR to GPT, we talked about that. That's I'll call it a GPT gen-like utility that came out with Creators Update. It basically converts that MBR to disk to GPT layout. It does a bunch of other things behind the scenes as well. So it's more than GPT Gen for those of you that are familiar with that utility that's been out on the internet forever and ever. It was created for converting non-system disks. However, I know some companies were using it as part of their Win 10 upgrade offering, although it wasn't supported by Microsoft at the time or ever. So MBR to GPT does a lot more than GPT Gen does. It handles a lot of those scenarios that you need to handle. It's completely non-destructive. You can run it on earlier supported versions of Windows 10 because you want to run it in Windows PE. The main reason for running it in Windows PE is, and I might be stealing some of my thunder, hang on. Yeah, so highly recommended to run it in Creators Update version of WinPE or later. Now, the main reason for that is if you have, once again, something that has kernel level drivers or filter drivers on the disk, like anti-malware or disk encryption, they could interfere. Actually, disk encryption, third-party disk encryption does not work with this. But anti-malware, something that's got hooks into the file system, could interfere with the process, and then you could be stuck with a machine that's useless and needs to be reloaded completely. When you boot into WinPE, you're not going to have any of that other stuff running. It'll have full access to the disk. It'll be able to convert it accordingly and go from there. You want to use the Microsoft recommended partitions at all costs for MBR to GPT. Those are kind of documented in TechNet as well. The recovery partition, if you've got BitLocker in play, you might not want to delete that. There's special handling there. There'll be some BCD entries that are associated with that can lead to unpredictable results. And it's only going to work on an MBR disk that has 3 partitions or less, because it's got to create partitions, and the maximum partition that an MBR disk can have is 4. So you just have to be careful with that. So if you've already got 4 partitions, it's not going to work because it has no room to start creating EFI partitions while it's still running under BIOS. And then for BitLocker, delete, recreate the protectors along with a few other things. Now, when I was doing a lot of in-place upgrade testing, I noticed some very strange behavior happening, and I think this was, I want to say it was with version 1607. I'm not sure if I tested this with 1703 at the time, but like I said, Windows is very finicky about its recovery partition. And one thing that I noticed was I would upgrade a BIOS machine to Windows 10 because you don't want to convert your disk while you're still in Win 7 for a couple of reasons. A, we want to be able to enable secure boot, and Windows 7 doesn't run under secure boot. So the process flow is, let's upgrade to Windows 10 first, then we'll do our disk conversion under WinPE, and then at the tail end we're now running Win 10 UEFI. In this particular case, there were 2 recovery partitions that were showing up, which it kind of had me scratching my head a little bit because I wasn't quite sure how it got there. If we look at the one on the right here, that's a 9.31 gig recovery partition, and you would have thought that Windows 10 would have had enough space to do what it needed to do inside that, but yet it still chose to create a 450 meg recovery partition. What I found was the partition type I think I've got a demo here, so let's just go to that. So what I found was in the native Microsoft step for a BIOS partition, it wasn't actually creating the recovery partition as a type 27, which is what the recovery partition needs to be. I'm not sure if they've actually fixed this. It would create it as type 7, which is a visible partition, and I got in the habit of actually dropping that recovery partition in the native config manager step and running this recovery partition dispart script after that. It did two things. I was able to set it to the actual type that it needed to be set to. B, I could keep the initial size of it to 499 meg. So there are two benefits to doing it that way. And then that way you don't end up with that double recovery partition, because MBR to GPT, what would happen is MBR to GPT would see that there's already 4 partitions on here and not be able to run and convert the disk. So that, let's take a look at the in-place upgrade task sequence flow. So this looks kind of similar. I like to update the BIOS, do the drivers before doing the in-place upgrade of the operating system, but where we're actually going to do the conversion is kind of in the post-OS portion here. So what we want, and I've seen some other examples out on the internet, is we want this task sequence to handle multiple scenarios. We don't want to just handle the ones that are BIOS only, and we're going to flip them to UEFI. We don't want to have a separate task sequence for that. So we want to be able to handle the case that, hey, this was already a UEFI device, but we need to know, was it a UEFI hybrid device? Was it a UEFI native device that just didn't have Secure Boot enabled? Or was this already a UEFI device with Secure Boot enabled? And in that case, we don't need to do anything at that point. We've upgraded the OS. It was a good system out of the gate to begin with. So what this does is this sets all those scenarios up here. So I set this BIOS and Secure Boot variables. I want to say I added a user voice for the Secure Boot state, so we could just consume that as a variable. But we're going to set this BIOS mode to legacy BIOS. And this is pretty easy. We're just going to say that if SMSTS boot UEFI equals false. But what this does is this will set it into a variable, and then we know that this machine came as an original legacy BIOS. So even after the reboot, when this variable gets reinitialized to true, we won't know that it actually came as a BIOS system. So we're just simply setting this into a variable called BIOS mode, and we're just saying legacy BIOS in this particular case. Now, the other thing we want to do also is we want to determine what the Secure Boot state is, and I really care if it's actually disabled. It's a little redundant setting it as enabled, but if it's disabled, there's a registry key that we key off of under current control set Secure Boot state UEFI Secure Boot enabled equals 0. So we'll zoom in for this. So we're really looking for that value. So if you're in an operating system that is Secure Boot capable, you'll have this registry key if it's capable. In the BIOS, if you boot Win 10 and BIOS, this registry key won't exist because the operating system is smart enough to know that it is not a Secure Boot capable OS. However, if it is, and it's just not enabled, it will show up like this. So take the case where we've upgraded a Windows 7 machine that was running UEFI hybrid to Windows 10. Well, Secure Boot's going to be off because it's mutually exclusive with UEFI hybrid, but we'll need to be able to track that. Enabled is the same key. It's just enabled is equal to 1 in this particular case here. But this gets us a variable called secure boot state, and we can key off of that. Now, in terms of the restart step, if we're already running UEFI native, we don't need to reboot, and even UEFI hybrid, we don't need to reboot. The only time that we're going to run MBR to GPT is if the disk is legacy BIOS and we're running MBR at that point. So in this particular case here is we're going to key off of the fact that the BIOS mode equals legacy BIOS, and we want to key off the fact of the hardware vendors that we support. I like to test task sequences out on virtual machines, and if this condition wasn't in here on a virtual machine, it would try to go ahead and run this, and it would fail because we can't do BIOS to UEFI on a Gen 1 Hyper-V VM, unless you did some really crafty thing and detaching the disk and creating a new Gen 2 VM and reattaching it, but that's really not what we're trying to test. We're trying to test on physical hardware, but we want to make sure that the main task sequence is working as well, because A, we want it to cover as many scenarios as possible. So there's no reason why you can't use this same task sequence on your VDIs machines, for example. If they happen to be legacy BIOS, they're going to stay legacy BIOS, and there's nothing we can do about that because they need to be recreated anyway. But in this particular case, we're going to restart into WinPE only if we're running legacy BIOS and we're on one of these hardware platforms. And we're going to restart into the boot image. So on a normal in-place upgrade task sequence, we don't associate a boot image. But since we want to reboot into WinPE, we associate our x64 boot image with this task sequence, and that way we could reboot into WinPE and run our MBR to GPT. Now, in the BIOS to UEFI section here, this is going to look a little bit different as well. We talked about secure boot state is not enabled. So if it's already enabled, we're good. We're running UEFI native with secure boot state enabled. We don't need to do any of this work. So we don't need to come in here. And then same thing for the machines as well. We don't need to come in here in the case of a VM, which would already we would skip over the restart step, so the VMs would process this step as well. We want to make sure that we don't come in here either on a VM because those will likely fail. Now, the first step here, and this is where I've seen different things on the internet on how to actually do this. I like to do the MBR to GPT first, because if MBR to GPT fails, and it fails gracefully because maybe it just couldn't create the partitions that it needs because you already have 4 partitions, or there's some, we'll call it a soft failure. It didn't actually remap the disk. It just couldn't run for some reason or another. No harm, no foul. We reboot. We're still legacy BIOS. The machine is still functional. However, if we switch the firmware settings before MBR to GPT in this case, and I've now enabled secure boot, which can only be programmatically enabled, cannot programmatically disable secure boot. That requires somebody physically being in front of the device, going F2 or F10 into the BIOS, or F1 in the case of Lenovo, navigating through the menus and saying disable secure boot. So if MBR to GPT fails gracefully, no harm, no foul. We want to leave that system in place. We don't want to disrupt the end user. We don't want to take them out of commission, create an additional trouble ticket, that kind of thing. We can address that failure, capture the logs. So we have capturing our logs into our log path here, so that we can review that, and maybe it was one of the machines that had 2 recovery partitions or something like that, and you can set to delete one of them, that kind of thing. So in this particular case, we've already run through a couple of to get into this step, and we only want to run it if we're legacy BIOS. And that's the only time we want to run this command in legacy BIOS. Now, you'll notice that I say continue on air, and if it's a hard failure, chances are the machine's just not going to boot up anyway. But if it's a soft failure, let's let it continue. We don't need to fail the task sequence at this point. It's still a functioning Win 10 machine. It's just not to our UEFI standard or secure boot standard in that case. So there's no reason to stop the task sequence here. Now, in the firmware settings, we're only going to go into this group here and do this if the last action succeeded equals true. So if the MBR to GPT step ran and it's true, and this is gonna apply to the previous steps as well. Let me see if I can resume that. So it's gonna apply to not only this step here, but it's also going to apply to this group here. Because if it skipped this group, it doesn't count that as a succeeded or fails. It counts this group. Because remember, we could have just been the UEFI hybrid if we came from that Win 7 UEFI hybrid scenario, and we want to flip on secure boot in that case. If you do have machines that don't play well with secure boot, I've heard of some issues with certain drivers, things like that. That's why you always want to test. You can have an exclusion saying, oh, this model is excluded from secure boot because of a known conflict with the current video card driver that we have until you get to apply the new one, that kind of thing. So you can have exclusions, but in this particular case, we'll go ahead and make our BIOS settings, change it to UEFI native, enable secure boot, and then for the restart, we're going to want to restart either way, whether we were in the full OS just doing the firmware settings or whether we were in WinPE at that particular point. We're going to restart either way with no conditions on that if we're in this actual group. And then lastly, we want to re-enable BitLocker. There's some things, and I'm pretty sure I've blogged about this. Ways I've found is to reset the Windows recovery environment using REagent C/disable. We'll want to re-enable that. I spit out the info just to collect the status of it in the logs, and then reset our BitLocker key protectors. So we delete those. You want to restart the computer after deleting them so that it's cleared. If you re-enable BitLocker before the restart, you will be prompted for the BitLocker recovery key. So just a handy little trick if you're doing this. Now, if you came from an earlier version of encryption and you want to switch to the later supported encryption like XTS256, you're either going to have to decrypt and re-encrypt. You're not going to be able to change the encryption type as part of this process. This is just reestablishing the key protectors so that the system continues to boot. So just for you BitLocker people out there, keep note of that. If you do want to get to the later encryption algorithms, you will have to decrypt and re-encrypt with those algorithms. So with that, that is an in-place upgrade task sequence that will work on existing BIOS machines or UEFI hybrid machines or UEFI native machines with or without secure boot, as well as being able to run it on VDIs. And that's the in-place upgrade. Now, the other thing that I had developed along with this is that there's a few different methods by other of my MVP colleagues that use a various amount of processes. Some are scripted, some do them in applications, some do them various methods. But what I did was sit down and define my requirements for doing dynamic drivers and BIOS updates. The goal was to be able to do it in full OS or WinPE. So in that task sequence step that we were just in, we had stuff running in either case. We could start off in an existing machine. We could still run those vendor utils in a full OS as well as WinPE. We can flash the BIOS in the full OS as well as WinPE, at least for most models. We want this process to work across our wipe and load task sequences as well as our in-place upgrade task sequences. Doing duplicate work, if you like doing duplicate work, that's one thing I don't like doing duplicate work, so I can go back to that Lego-like modular method of having one method that works across both. We've simplified the administration that goes along with it. Method, I also don't like editing task sequences, especially in our environment. You edit a task sequence and that kicks off replication, and there's tons of policies associated with it, and you've just taken out imaging for your entire company if you're a large company. If you're a smaller company, changes will replicate out much faster. But when you mark a task sequence as gold, you don't really want to touch that task sequence again unless you've got an absolute emergency. You want that task sequence to live on until you replace it with the next task sequence. Supporting production as well as pre-production. Piloting, I'm a big fan of piloting. You could never pilot enough. Always going to uncover certain issues. Whereas if you just pilot once or you don't pilot at all and you release it, you start running into issues and you try to fix those and release it again and run into more issues. So having a pre-production capability, maybe this BIOS update doesn't play well with the latest vendor tools or something else. We want to be able to run that in our production TS, but do pilot testing with that pre-production task sequence. And then lastly, easy, intuitive, reusable. I'm a big fan of that. Making things that are overly complicated that you can't easily hand off to other members of your team or new people that onboard. It's always difficult to wash your hands of it and turn it over and go on to something next, something else. So you probably noticed a couple sections up here where I have updating the BIOS. Basically, I set a BIOS flag. Now, this could be done a couple different ways. We're going to key off of some variables. And these variables, first we're going to see if they actually exist, and then we're going to check and see if this release date is less than our target's BIOS date. Now, you could use the throw mud up against the wall and see what sticks approach, meaning, whatever's the latest, it'll try to flash it. If it sees that what's running is newer, then it'll just gracefully fail and go on. That's an equivalent approach, but I like to be a little bit more precise. And you can't really compare versions of BIOS releases because there'll be a very cryptic string value depending upon the vendor, and comparing one string to another string doesn't always get you the result that you're looking for. Is this BIOS release newer or older than the one that's on there? But the target BIOS date always seems to work well because you can, that BIOS is definitely older, we need to upgrade it, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, the manufacturers don't publish this information anywhere, so it's a matter of flashing a system, seeing what the BIOS date looks like in WMI, and then adding that that to your entry. Now, this particular process basically uses the MDT database, not creating any additional work. So for those of you that are already using MDT and the MDT database, there's not a whole lot of extra work that you need to do in this particular case. You will define your makes and models in here, and you'll run your MDT gather scripts accordingly with some rules. I'm not going to go too deep into it because I know I'm running a little short on time here. But basically, after you've extended the database with these particular fields here, you'll see that I've got a target BIOS date that's set here. I've got a command that I can run, and I've got a BIOS package. Now, keep in mind, I can also define my Win10 driver package as well. And if I'm still having to deploy Windows 7 on this model, I can define a Win7. So we're even backward compatible. Will work. You can extend this to your heart's content, basically here. And when it queries it, it'll read these variables in. You can use those variables as comparison in your task sequence, and it'll go from there. So that's that. Now back to the task sequence. Where the magic comes into play is, if we're going to flash the BIOS, we want to check a couple of things. Is the BIOS update equals true? Is on battery equals false? We don't really want to flash on battery. Some of the utilities will prevent you from flashing if it's on battery. But we're going to set some BIOS variables. So I originally talked about this in Hacking the Task Sequence session I gave at MMS MOA last year, which we're basically calling the download package content step. But what we can do is we can pre-populate some of these variables ahead of time, and then it'll dynamically fetch our package that we want, whatever package we want. So we set the destination directory, and this is the key thing here, is this BIOS package is what we're getting from our MDT database. It'll say, oh, I want you to download that package. It'll actually do a dynamic content location request because it's not directly referenced in the task sequence anywhere. So it'll know to get it. We're going to put it into a variable called BIOS, which is going to be a 01 will be appended on the tail end for the first package, 02 if we had more, but we're just downloading one particular package here. And in this case, we're just downloading it using this particular executable. And you might wonder what this executable is or does. However, if you've actually used the step right here, download package content step, this step runs that executable in the background. And these are the variables that get pre-populated when you click and fill out the form. So all we're doing in this particular case is just calling the executable that's behind the scenes and pre-populating the variables with this step here. Now, if you do have this for other packages that are directly defined in your task sequence, you want to reset those variables. So I just blanked them all out because otherwise you'll be re-downloading the BIOS package. They don't get reset. When you run the step natively, it creates them and destroys them on the fly. But when you hack at them and set them yourself, they don't get destroyed. So you just need to clear them out, that kind of thing. And then it's a matter of flashing the BIOS from there, running the command that we pulled from the database, and also the key was the start in directory here. So no BIOS is, otherwise it'll throw a fit, and you can set that this way here. So with that, the drivers are a little bit simpler. Setting the same variables again, downloading them, and resetting them, and then we can use those drivers here one of two ways. If we pre-populated it, so we want to run this step if drivers 01 exists, right here, and if that exists, we're going to set that path to where we had staged them right here in a variable. And if we don't have a model defined yet, we don't want to fail it, so we'll just say that drivers 01 was not found, because maybe you're testing a new model in your environment, you don't have a driver package for it yet, and we go from there. So that's that. I know we got about 3 minutes left, and let me just think I've got thank you, some questions, and real quick, briefly, I talked about patching WIMs. I did some analysis on this. These were some of the patch sizes for 1703. The first one that was released was only 114 meg, and the sixth one that was released was up to 706 meg. I haven't checked lately. I think they're well over a gig in size now. And then what happens if you patch these WIM files? So the blue is if you had stacked the WIM, or if you patch the base WIM each month. So by the sixth patch, I just directly applied it to the released installed WIM. It only increases it to 3.96. But if you're taking and servicing that WIM every month, just stacking it on top of what you had previously, your WIM file really starts to grow in size. So just be conscious of that when you're in your Windows as a Service strategy. And hopefully we'll have more coming on that, how we do that in our environment in the coming months. Only at MMS MOA for those of you that are planning on making it. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and we'll open it up for questions. Always feel free to hit me up on Twitter's usually the best place if you got questions or whatever there. And any questions?
Yeah, we'll take a few minutes. Thanks so much, Mike. Great presentation, demos. There's about 33 people on the line right now. So if you got questions, you could either IM in the IM window or unmute yourself and ask away. We'll give about 5-6 minutes for questions before we bring Adam on. All right, I'm guessing nope. There's a question on. Looks like Fletcher from 1E. Probably know him. Any automation that you have seen for clearing, not just enabling TPM?
Yes. So you can clear the TPM depending upon the physical presence setting. And yeah, it depends. However, if you know the TPM owner password, you can also clear the TPM using PowerShell. If you don't know the TPM owner password, then more than likely it's going to require physical presence. But with HP models, they made it recently in the October BIOS updates so that you could clear the TPM even if you didn't know the TPM owner password. But the caveat is you have to have an HP system BIOS password set, which is a double-edged sword because I could see exploits taking advantage of that relatively easily. If you don't have BIOS password set, I can now set one, I can clear your TPM, and leave you in a very bad state. So yes, it is possible. For those of you that use HPs or models that use Infineon chips, there was a vulnerability that was published in October, I believe it was. So you do want to be flashing your TPM just like you flash your BIOS. It is tricky. You can do it without decrypting the drive as well. You just have to follow certain steps. But yeah, TPMs are a bit tricky, and they leave the clearing up to the vendors themselves. So it's not a defined part of the specification, whether you require physical presence or not. they kind of leave that up to the vendor to do, and that's why HP implemented that, because of the feedback they had received from their customers on that. Yep, that's exactly the. I don't know if it's owner authorization or owner password off the top of my head. I forget, but yeah, you pass it the password, and then and it will clear. So the other thing to note too, starting with I believe it was 1607 Windows 10, Microsoft actually discards. It'll auto provision the TPM if it's not provisioned, which means it'll own the TPM, and it discards the TPM owner password. So if you're using something like MBAM and you want to retain the TPM owner password, which is highly recommended, see Jorgen Nilsson's blog on it, ccmexec.com. Just search on TPM or MBAM. It will be one of the blog hits that comes up. He's got a great method for retaining that TPM owner password so that you can get it into the MBAM database so that you're not left without it. Any other questions?
Perfect, thanks. And so if there's other questions that come up, Mike does have a Twitter handle as well. You can DM him, follow him, and I will share the recording back to the Meetup email distribution later today once I get it up on OneDrive and does the syncing. With that, I'm not sure if Mike, you're sticking around for a while for the rest of it, just in case there's IM questions.
Certainly.
Okay, so Mike will be here for probably another 30 minutes or so. At this time, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Adam Dzyacky. Right? Hopefully, I didn't kill that. Hopefully, I didn't kill that. So Adam's going to go into PowerShell automation and Microsoft Service Manager with the Exchange connectors. Something he's put together. It's on GitHub, and he's going to go through what that means, what it does, and again, same thing. I am for questions, and we'll open up for questions at the end of the session as well. Thanks. With that, Adam, you're on.
Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening. Same kind of rigmarole. My name is Adam Dzyacky. I am a senior cloud operations engineer over at BCU, and I've put together this PowerShell script, this PowerShell runbook, to really kind of bring an alternative to what's possible with Microsoft System Center Service Manager and their out-of-box Exchange connector. So for those of you not familiar with the out-of-box Exchange connector, or maybe even Service Manager is Microsoft's, or at least System Center's, CMDB tool. It's the thing that lets us create tickets. It creates change requests. We can log configuration items, and we can track basically like all the changes in our environment. It is Microsoft's CMDB. And one of the features that Microsoft that it adds to the CMDB is, at least from the ticketing channel, is the ability to monitor an Exchange inbox, and then every couple minutes it's going to find all the emails that are sitting in the inbox, all the unread emails, and then it's going to convert all of those into Service Manager incidents or service requests. So you have to pick which one you want. And you can have multiple Exchange connectors. I believe, last that I recently heard, the recommendation is around 15. And that's how your end users can interact with your IT team. They can email things to the Service Desk inbox. Service Manager picks that thing up, and then it converts it into an incident or a service request. And it does that really well. In fact, that's probably the primary means that I think most people really interact with Service Manager, at least one's business interacts with for Service Manager. Sorry, I don't know if I'm getting sick, the weather or something. And so that's how typically people interact with Service Manager. And it's also another way, another mechanism for this is the IT department, or even members of the business interact with it in terms of updating work items. So if I want to approve or reject review activities, I can do that from email. If I want to resolve incidents from email, I can. So I can update my work items. And if I just send even notes about a work item, as long as I keep the work item in the subject of the email, anything in the body of that email gets appended to that respective work item's action log. And again, it does this great, it works, but if I had it my way, I've always wanted just something a little bit more out of it. And that was kind of like the first problem I ran into with the Exchange Connector, is that, well, it is a sealed management pack from Microsoft. It is written in C#, and really, you have to be a service manager SDK expert almost. I mean, you have to be a developer, certainly, to put something like this together. And I didn't like that either, because the more I thought on it, I realized, well, the chances of someone being an administrator of one of these programs and also an expert level developer, that crossover seemed unlikely. And with as much as Microsoft is continually pushing PowerShell as the future of not only just automation but server administration, it seemed to make sense that, well, again, if I was going to build my own version in hopes of others using it and others modifying and contributing it and allowing them to change it, maybe the best language to do this in is PowerShell, because if it ends up in PowerShell, it can become an SMA runbook, it could become an Azure Automation runbook. So it would become highly portable, and it would become highly usable, and it would mean that more people could contribute to this conversation that previously couldn't. It's no longer left to just developers to create this solution. And so that's where this open source PowerShell Exchange Connector kind of came into being. Now it's been about, I believe we're coming up on 3-4 years of the Microsoft Exchange Connector as a version 3.1 with no changes, no patches, no updates. It works as it does out of the box, and that's the way that it is. And so with that, if you're in the Service Manager space, the chances of you maybe interacting with this PowerShell module known as SMlets seem a little bit higher. And SMlets is another open source PowerShell module that was created to administer Service Manager and make it just easier to administer Service Manager with PowerShell. And so what I'm going to go over next is some of the features and how we can configure this thing. But the connector as it is right now, again, it is written entirely in PowerShell. It is written entirely with SMlets. It mirrors all of the functionality of the out-of-box one provided by Microsoft, so there is no change in your current processes if you wanted to, convert over to this. And it adds a bunch of new features, and it adds a bunch of features that I wanted, and seemingly I wasn't alone in wanting, because if you're a Cyrusson customer or you're familiar with the Cyrusson community, Cyrusson is a company that extends the Service Manager platform, and they run their own community forums with a lot of great feedback on making Service Manager better, with making process better, and just kind of overall improving Service Manager. And I tend to hang out there quite a bit, and I found a few other like-minded people, such as myself, that said, we want this out of the Exchange Connector, or Service Manager doesn't do this like this other ticketing system did. And so we started finding a lot of common ground. So some of the new features. So like I said, it does everything the current one does out of the box. If you send in emails, it'll create incidents or service requests. If you update work items, it appends things to the action log. There is, again, zero change in the functionality from Exchange Connector provided by Microsoft to this one. But the new features that we added, again, all with PowerShell and SMlets, were the following. So the first one has kind of been a pain point, I think, for a lot of people, is if your company has corporate signatures in their graphics, corporate graphics in their signatures, got that backwards. Those end up as attachments on work items. And if I'm an analyst working at, level 1, level 2, or anywhere really in Service Manager, I may be going into the related items tab, right? So as far as the process goes, I may be spending a lot of time sifting through related items and attachments to figure out what the real attachment was. If someone sends me a screenshot, I want to go look at that screenshot, but I do not want to hunt through the attachments to figure out, oh, that's a signature graphic, delete. That's a signature graphic, not this one. Okay, here's the real attachment that I'm after. And then not to mention, it gets a little bit exacerbated when that work item maybe changes hands between analysts, because now another analyst may have to go through the same exact process all over again if the one before them did not clean up those attachments. So this is just a process efficiency gain. You can set the minimum file attachment size on the connector. So you can say everything less than 20, 25 kilobytes, just don't add as an attachment. The other thing you'll notice, and I have a screenshot here of it, is the current Exchange connector, the Microsoft Exchange connector, it adds files to the related items tab, and it shows the file name, it shows the file size, but it does not show the attached by relationship. And if you're really paying close attention in Service Manager, the attached by relationship is only set when you interact with Service Manager through the console, through the Microsoft console. And I didn't really like this from if I had multiple people on a chain of emails and they were all updating the same work item, I want to know who attached what. I want to know whose attachment was whose. And so, again, using the power of Active Directory and the Service Manager CMDB, as those emails come in, if you're adding attachments to your work items, the sender will be marked accordingly for their attachments. So you'll know, in this case, Adam is the one that sent this email. And again, this is all using SMlets, all the native SDKs. The third one, and this is one that I'm not sure where it came from, but I kind of just concocted this idea a while ago that there's this scheduled start and end time on work items, and out of the box it doesn't do anything. It's a date field. It has almost no value until you put some value and you assign some value to it. But you have to be the one editing that value. Like an analyst has to go in and change the scheduled start and end time on an incident or a service request or a change request. And if you haven't modified the out-of-box forms, you may not be able to get to some of those fields. So it makes it difficult to interact in some cases with the scheduled start and end times. And in this dream automation world of mine, because I really love PowerShell and I like automating things, is, well, could I schedule a change request in such a way that at the scheduled time is when the change request actually kicked off, right? If my change request template had a runbook or some kind of automated process inside of it, could I have another runbook that exists outside of Service Manager, whether it be in Azure Automation or SMA, that looks in on Service Manager and says, get me those scheduled start and end times, get me those work items, and now execute them? And again, all I was describing there is, these are just some scheduled start and end times. So that's why the third point is something I think is super fantastic, is that if you can schedule work items with this connector. So if you send an Outlook meeting request to the Exchange connector now, to Service Manager, it will not only create a new work item, but it will set the scheduled start and end times based on the start and end time of that appointment. And this also works for work items that are currently in the system as well. So if you want to schedule a meeting request about a current change request that's already been submitted, about a service request, about an incident that's already in the system, it will add it to the action log just like it would if it were a regular email, but it will also additionally update the start and scheduled end times on that work item. The other scenario where this came up from an incident and service request perspective was, is this a better way that we can now interact with our end users? I can tell you that our level 1 and level 2 teams have started using this to say, well, this is when I'm gonna ping you next, or this is when I'm gonna come over to your desk, or this is when we're gonna plan to meet. And so now we can report on those times against incidents and service requests and derive some meaning out of that. Next, This is a feature that has existed in other ticketing systems, but it again doesn't exist in the out-of-box Exchange connector for Microsoft, is I want to assign something to myself. So if a work item is currently in the system, you know, IR 513 there, or down at the bottom, right? I put the work item in the subject, and then in the body of the email, I just have to put the new take keyword. And then Service Manager, again, it will recognize that I am the one that sent that email, and it will make me the assigned to user of that work item. So if you have notifications that go out to your support teams and Service Manager that say like, hey, this incident or this work item has just been assigned to the group and no one's currently assigned to it, you can now build a new HTML link on those emails that says, you know, click here to take. And if you don't know how to do that, if that's the first you're hearing of that, I have some examples that I'll get to later to show you how to build those kind of things. Next is the ability to leave private comments. So by default, if I update a work item from email through the Exchange connector, it will add it to the action log, and it's a public comment. Now, I should add, it's a public comment assuming one of two things. I am the assigned user, or I am the affected user. And if you're using Cyreson's action log notify, or you've built your own action log notify, you may have a mechanism in place that says, you know, when the action log gets updated with a public comment, you know, email the other person. It's fairly common, and I think that's something a lot of Service Manager deployments have done. However, what happens if someone who's not the assigned to, who's not the affected user, emails and updates that work item? Now, you may already know this, you may not, but it will mark that comment as null on the action log. It's not public and it's not private. But the point is, any action log notifier typically doesn't fire on this mechanism. It doesn't trigger on a null comment. And not to mention, who should it trigger to, right? It's a scenario that really hasn't been addressed, and that the stock Exchange connector just leaves it as the null value. So not only can you change that in the PowerShell connector here, but now I can explicitly call out with a hashtag or pound, however you prefer to go with that, private in my message, and not only will it add it to the action log as a comment, but it will mark it as private. So this is great if you want to pass notes between, you know, analysts, as one typically does for the private function. The whole point of that private function is so that you can keep things between analysts. And now you can do it from email. The next one, which is one I'm particularly proud about, is merge threaded replies into a single default work item. And I'll be the first to admit, that could use a better name, right? I could explain that probably better, and so I certainly will. So here's a scenario that exists in the current Exchange connector, and it's this. Let's say I, Adam, I'm gonna send in an email to Service Manager, and I'm gonna say like, hey, you know, everything's on fire, things are broken. And I'm gonna also CC Jay on the call here, and maybe a people in the organization. Right? And again, the Exchange connector hasn't run yet, right? It runs every 5 minutes. And so I send an email out to Jay and to Service Manager. And let's say we're, you know, that's like at 1 minute in, right? So another 4 minutes before the Exchange connector runs. And then Jay decides to reply all. And Jay replies back and says like, hey, you know, I think everything may be fine, but this is related to a change that happened over the past weekend. Now, I get that message, right? I, Adam, receive that message, and I know, oh, okay, that looks like that. But Jay also included Service Manager. This is now, let's say, 1:30 into this discussion, right? And then we fast forward to 5 minutes ahead, right? The Exchange connector is running every 5 minutes. On the next run of the Exchange connector, it'll go, hey, Adam, I found your email. Oh, and Jay's on it, and I have to relate him to the new work item. I'm going to create the new work item. Adam's the affected user. Jay's a related user. It goes to the next email, and it says, oh, Jay sent an email. Okay, I have to create a new work item. I have to make him the affected user. Oh, he CC'd Adam. Okay, so I have to make Adam a related user to this new work item, and then I'm done, right? And so what I've done here is, well, we have two duplicate work items, really, for lack of a better term. right? Jay and I are talking about the same thing. We're on the same thread, and yet Service Manager counts this as two distinct work items. Now, either you know this is happening and you're annoyed by it, or you don't know it's happening and this is news to you, in which case you're like, oh, that explains all the duplicates that we're getting every month, how to prevent that. So the Exchange connector here, the PowerShell one, actually goes just one step further. Every time it processes email, it actually goes to Exchange, it reaches in, and it grabs the conversation ID. Now, if you knew that or you didn't know the conversation ID was there, as I and a few others in the Cyrusen community started discussing, we realized, it kind of hit us, and we felt a little stupid about it, but eventually it's like, no, that's the way it works, is if you're in Outlook or any modern mail client, everything's in a conversation view already, right? When I reply to people or I start new threads with people, Outlook keeps those emails grouped together. It must know how to do that somehow. And the way that it knows how to do that is because Exchange processes a conversation ID. And so then Outlook just, groups all those things together. So this connector takes advantage of that Exchange functionality and writes the conversation ID into the attachment in Service Manager. And so that means every subsequent run of the Exchange connector, of this PowerShell Exchange connector, or even the current run of the PowerShell Exchange connector, if it finds an email that came in that was a reply and does not have a work item in the subject, it'll go into Service Manager and rip through the CMDB to figure out which work item is this actually about. And then instead of creating a brand new work item, it will append that reply in the conversation to the action log of the one work item, of the one correct work item. So this cuts down on duplicates. This improves some process efficiency, and it gets you closer to an actual number of, the emails and work items that are, at least the number of work items being created by email every month. That's a valuable statistic to know. Another one that came up, and I don't know how big of a desire there has been for this, but this was one nonetheless that I thought, well, it can't hurt to do. And that was the support for digitally signed and encrypted emails. The Stock Exchange connector can't process digitally signed or encrypted messages. It doesn't know how to handle certificates. So with the PowerShell Exchange connector here, I've chosen to leverage MineKit, which is a open source C# library for processing digitally signed and encrypted messages. And I say C#, but it doesn't really matter that it's C#. I just got the assembly and I've imported it into PowerShell, and again, it works just like native PowerShell. So you don't have to be a C# or even .NET veteran. You just have to have some fundamental understanding of PowerShell to see how this thing works. The other one is announcement integration. So starting with Service Manager 2012, certainly had some nuances with announcements out of the box. If you're using the Cyrusen portal, they have their own announcement feature, which you can target groups specifically, but they're not really in sync. Now, there is a Cyrusen SCSM ticker, which allows you to publish announcements to computers based on, I think, like an XML file, or you create an announcement in Service Manager and it knows how to parse that to send it out to all the computers. But the point of it is, there's three different avenues here. You can optionally use the Cyrusen SCSM ticker. You may or may not be a Cyrusen portal customer. And there's also the core Service Manager announcements. And at least what I've seen in my experience is people just opt not to use those. It's easier just to, I'm going to send an email. I'm going to send an email to all the affected people, or I'm going to send it to a few distribution groups, right? And they opt not to use these really awesome features that are available in these products. And so to make that make it more appealing to use all those things, is the PowerShell Exchange connector also will now process emails that feature a new announcement keyword, and can now create announcements in either Core Service Manager or the Cyrusen platform, or both. And it does this using either regular emails or calendar appointments, so you could set the, the end time of that announcement. Then there's SCSM integration. So if you're using Microsoft Operations Manager, this is probably like the newest, most recently added feature. It's fairly young right now, and it basically just lets you say, I want to get the health of a distributed application through Service Manager. So you can just drop the name of your distributed application inside of the body of the email, and you could send that to Service Manager, and Service Manager will reach over to SCSM, grab the distributed application, grab all of the alerts, if any, associated with it, and then send you an email back about the health of that day. So this gives some email integration with Operations Manager that previously didn't exist. And then finally, again, I've said, if you're a Cyrusson customer, no less again here, if you're using their knowledge base or their service catalog, which is part of their Service Manager portal, the connector also does two new neat tricks based on that. So now, if I email a work item in, let's say I'm submitting a brand new thing, my computer's broken. When the PowerShell Exchange connector runs and it finds this new email, because the work item isn't in the subject, it's not a reply, it knows it has to go create something new, apart from creating the incident or service request in Service Manager, it'll rip through the Cyrusson knowledge base and then email back suggested knowledge base articles to the affected user based on the content of their email. And again, this also goes one step further. If you have service requests or request offerings that are published out to your portal, and you're trying to get your organization to use self-service instead of always emailing everything in, this works pretty much exactly like the knowledge base function. A new email comes in, a new work item is created. It'll rip through the Cyrusson service catalog based on the user that sent it. So we're going to obey the security scope of the sender's confines on the Cyrusson portal. So we're only going to search for requests that we know they could even submit, and then we're going to only find the requests that, again, match content in the email, and then we're going to send those back in an email to the affected user. And optionally, if you want to turn both of these features on, it'll only send one email. It doesn't send two separate emails. It's just one summarized email. And so those are the features that exist today, right now, on GitHub for the PowerShell Exchange connector. So here's a few things that are in planning, discussion, kind of just popped into my head as I've been thinking about how to keep improving this thing. I'd like to do some Cyrusson asset management integrations. If you're not familiar with Cyrusson's asset management solution, I think it's really well built. It's really well rounded. And I'd really like to be able to process emails from particular vendors differently. Instead of creating work items, what if I created purchase orders or change requests, or linked the email as an attachment to a new hardware asset? I think there's just a lot of ideas in this space, and it's hard to know where to begin here. I want to do more detailed logging so that if something does go wrong with the connector, you could see exactly where it failed, rather than just letting the PowerShell script run. But this is also available if you turn on enhanced logging in SMA, if you choose to run the connector there. Another one that I think, at least I've talked about a little bit with a few people, and they seem to be on the fence about, is runbook integration. Now, there's two sides of this. One is, well, it seems really cool if I could kick off runbooks in either Orchestrator, SMA, or Azure Automation directly from email. It also seems unbelievably terrifying that I could kick off runbooks from Orchestrator, SMA, or Azure Automation. And also, does it circumvent any service manager processes you may be creating if you're saying, just kick off the runbook instead of creating an incident or something? Again, it's just up in the air of, it seems like a neat idea. What's the best way and most secure way to implement that? And it's probably going to hang off of the digitally signed encrypted messages more than anything to kind of do identity verification. Another one that has come up has been round robin assignment. And I figured, if I have a connector, if I have a PowerShell Exchange connector already talking to Exchange, I could maybe do some really interesting things around the analyst being out of office, around the analyst having more work assigned to them in Service Manager than other analysts, and automatically assigning new things based on that logic of are they in the office, are they out of the office, are they going to be out of the office in the next week, et cetera, et cetera. Another one that you can't do with the Stock Exchange connector, this is actually one that comes up quite a bit for new Service Manager deployments, is on review activities, people may unknowingly add an Active Directory group with an email address to a review activity. And they may think that, oh, I put the group in there and then everybody gets, to vote, right? And that's exactly how it works. It would send an email to everyone in the group. The problem is that anyone approving it isn't part of the reviewers list. The Stock Exchange connector doesn't know how to do that match. It doesn't know that if there's 5 people in the group and one of them replies back, oh, I know how to accept the vote on behalf of an AD group. So again, just seems like a cool feature. And then last but not least, someone messaged me in the last month and they said like, oh, OCR may be interesting. Like what if, the screenshots that people were emailing in could be parsed for their context, right? And then thrown into like the description of a service request or an incident, or another field or something. Again, it's up in the air. Ideas, all these things are available to talk about on GitHub. So in terms of where can you find out more, or how can you get it, how can you contribute, how do you find this thing, how do you look at feature requests, here's a few links that can help you get started in the right direction. First is the Stuyvesant community. Like I said, I hang out there quite a bit because I love Service Manager, I love PowerShell, I like obviously this Exchange connector. I'm a little bit biased probably. So you can find more about it there. If you go to GitHub here, you can see this is where you can actually go download the actual connector, or you can just Google SMlets Exchange connector. And again, the community is where I first posted this. It's also where I reached out to a few individuals by the name of Tom Hendricks, Martin Blomgren, Leigh Kilday, and Brian Weist, who they certainly helped in terms of reviewing, adding some code, pointing some bugs out. They've been really helpful in getting this thing going. And so that's where you can find out more. And I think, Jay, if I'm not mistaken, is it like 30 or so minutes?
Yeah, I think we're good, long as everybody else is good. But if you're wrapping up, then just go ahead and take whatever last few minutes you need. Okay.
So then the very last thing I'll show is so I have a connector here. I'll also go over to GitHub. You can see here's the GitHub repo. Recently I've had some change. It's now 2.2% JavaScript. And if you're curious, well, I thought you said it was all PowerShell, Adam. What's the 2.2%? There is a feature that was added that was the send Outlook meeting thing that I talked about, how you could send Outlook meeting requests and the connector would process them. If you're using the Cyrusson portal for Service Manager, this version now includes a task that you can add to work items so that directly from the portal, it'll kick open your Outlook client to send a scheduled appointment to the affected user and your Service Manager inbox account. You can see you can also, it's at 8 issues. Most of them are feature requests. There's also a wiki here that tells you some of the benchmarks that we run, like the examples of how we tested this, how you could set this up for Task Manager. If you want to run this directly on your workflow server, again, there's really no right or wrong way here. It's PowerShell. And again, best of all it's PowerShell. So if you want to change something, if you want to add something, if you don't want to use something, if you want to alter functionality, if you want to disagree with us and do something different with it, that's the power of making this thing open source and also being available in PowerShell, is you could change this to do whatever you want, but you don't have to. Just those features are there. And so that's why, just to get in the PowerShell a little bit here, the first section is really dedicated towards, would you want to create incidents by default? How are you going to authenticate to Exchange? What is the incident template you're going to use? Do you want to process calendar appointments? So there's true-false flags, all in the beginning of this configuration so that you can decide which features you want to enable. Maybe you just want to test this to make sure that it does in fact mirror all of the out-of-box Exchange Connector functionality before turning on other parts of it. You can certainly do that. You can see here's the SCOM integration, the announcement integration, SCOM integration. Again, just like the stock Exchange Connector, you can change the keywords to be whatever you want. This will absolutely honor them. And then we start getting into SMlets and the core functionality of this thing of all the classes we need to interact with Service Manager. Here's all of the functions that are very modular in nature, the ones that create things, update things, attach email, attach files, add comments, all sorts of things. And you can see here's just the main loop. So back to the beginning, the original Exchange Connector, whether you know it or not, can only process this type of message, IPM.note, which is an email. If you send an email, that is the class of that message behind the scenes. But you can see that, well, this is how we can handle encrypted emails, signed emails, meeting requests that get canceled. So if you have custom things in your environment, let's say you have a phone system in your environment that integrates with Exchange in some way, but when they send email notifications, it's a slightly different type of message class, you can add that in here and you can address that. You can process those types of messages. It's meant to be open and allow you to make whatever kind of changes you want to it. And then if you're on the Cybersyn community, you can find me there. If you're not on the Cybersyn community, but you are interested in Service Manager, or you're struggling with the Exchange Connector, you also want it to do more, or you just have a question for me, you can find me there. I generally try to respond to messages pretty quickly, and that's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it. Any questions for Adam at this point around his script, Service Manager, the Cybersyn community, anything that he can answer for you guys? Put in an IM window or unmute and feel free to speak.
Oh, Brian's actually on the call. Yeah, Brian, I hope you guys see the video content. I was sharing.
Oh yeah, I see that. Yeah, he was sharing. So what else? The next remote session we do, it seems like a couple of people had issues with Skype. I noticed in some environments, depending on the certain financial environments, especially certain screen sharing, content sharing is disabled at a proxy. I'm working with a couple of companies like that right now. But so what I'll do is I'll try to do a WebEx, which it seems to be more stable when it comes to getting it work for everybody. So I'll try to do that next one over. Any questions for Adam or Mike? Mike is still on the phone around UEFI, BIOS, Windows 10, System Center, OSD. Perfect. All right, so it looks like we don't have any questions. It's about 12:40. We'll give back everybody 20 minutes. This has been a good remote session. We'll probably do another remote session in a couple of months. In December, we're trying to get an in-person meeting going here in the Chicagoland area, and then we'll come back in January for another remote session. Look out for the meetup site, and this has been recorded, so I'll put this up on the OneDrive and then share the link back to the meetup group. If there's any other questions that come up, I'll share Adam and Mike's Twitter handles as well, so you can follow him and follow them and ask some questions directly. Thanks everybody for joining, and have a good rest of today, rest of November, and good December and holidays. We'll look forward to seeing some of you in person next month. Thank you so much.